What if I told you that thousands of .NET developers have been making their own life harder by adding unnecessary code to their projects? They are making debugging a nightmare. They are slowing down their own applications. And they do all of that while following the best practices. In the past few years, I have reviewed a ton of code bases. I have worked with several companies from startups to big companies. And I realized something. In my experience, most teams add to their own projects MediatR, but in fact is more of an overhead than a benefit. They would have a simpler and maintainable code base without it. Look, I know that this feels controversial, and I don't want to go after MediatR because of the recent license changes. In fact, I think that the new license is a good license, okay? Considering that they moved to MediatR to a licensed model, a commercial model, if you read the new license, you will see that, in fact, is something that seems fair, because there's some restrictions to the paid model that will allow most companies to still use them. And for those that will need to pay for it, in fact, they are in a good place and they are taking advantage of that library, so it's not that bad as we initially thought about it. In fact, I have another video that I will link somewhere here where I talk about the opportunity that this whole process of open source projects going commercial means for us as .NET developers. And it's about that I am basing this opinion. Not because of the commercial license, it's more about what we have been doing for a long time. Recently, I have been discussing this process of moving out of MediatR with many different people, many different developers. When I talk with them, one of the first questions usually is, how are you doing to move projects from MediatR to out of MediatR? And many think about replacing MediatR with other libraries. Many are trying to use different things just to replace what they used to have. And I think we are missing an opportunity, and it's about that we'll talk now. Even if you want to replace MediatR, or if you are thinking about adopting MediatR, or if you have MediatR in place and you are just keep to using it, take a look into this video, because we will talk about that, about the moments where you need MediatR, about the moments where maybe there's something wrong. Because maybe you probably have been told that the MediatR is the professional way of building .NET applications. Maybe you have even felt guilty for questioning whether that extra abstraction is really worth it. Well, you are not crazy for thinking that. Your instincts, in my opinion, are in fact spot on. Here's what most developers don't realize. The same companies and the same software architects promoting MediatR are quietly using much simpler patterns in their online performance systems. And what's the difference? The difference is knowing when that complexity will pay for itself, or when that complexity is just complexity. It's just one abstraction that feels fancy. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the 3 specific scenarios where MediatR actually makes sense, the hidden costs that no one is talking about them, and most importantly, the extremely simple alternatives that will make your code simpler, easier to debug, and will make your team happier, and you don't need MediatR for that. By the end of this video, you will have a clear way to think about that decision, kind of like a framework. And you might have just saved yourself months of unnecessary headaches. So, trust me, I believe that your future self will thank you for watching this video. So let's talk about where we are at now. So in the .NET development space, we have a kind of like a quiet epidemic, where when you get into any development team, likely they have started using something like a template, something like a starting guide or something like that, and maybe on that project you will have a ton of preconceived ideas. And one of them is that the right way to do things is going in a CQRS way and then use something like MediatR. And on the surface, it looks professional, it looks simple, enterprise grade. But here's the thing, I have seen this pattern being repeated 1,000 of times. Those teams are nowadays spending significantly more time debugging simple features because they have more abstraction layers. And when they onboard a new developer, it will take a bit more time to understand that, okay, the problem is here, not here. And going through all of those abstractions brings a cognitive load that I don't think in many cases is useful. So let me paint you a picture that might be useful to understand what I mean. Imagine a developer, let's call him Mike. Mike joins a new team. He's excited, motivated, he picks the first bug to do something there. The code base at the first glance looks impressive, looks enterprise grade, and there's a mediator everywhere. You have commands, you have queries, they are well organized, everyone has a place, they are separated by concern, and Mike will be, okay, this is a dream team, okay, I'm in a great project. But then when he starts taking a look into the bug ticket and tries to debug it, to understand what's happening, where the code goes through, he will understand that it's not as simple as it might look like. Because when we look into files, it might look fancy, but it could be simpler doing exactly the same thing in a different way. So while in a traditional setup, you will have likely something like a controller action, and that controller action might have the code there or call a service class. That service class would maybe interact with an external service or a database or something like that, and it's just done. Now, Mike needs to understand what is mediator. What's the pattern of mediator? What's the library of mediator? And if you are using mediator with a pipeline, he needs to understand that first. And now he's jumping between controllers that send commands, and it's not clear for him who's been handling it. And maybe now he needs to go through all of those hoops to understand, okay, the logic is part of the handler. I need to find the correct handler, put the breakpoint there, and take it from there. But what if there's some behaviors in between, for example, for validation or for logging? But now it took a ton of time understanding all of that pipeline for something that could be a 10-minute fix. So it looks like an expedition, archaeology, trying to understand where things are. But here's the kicker. It will not complain, because this is what feels a real enterprise software. When you look into templates out there, they are organized this way. So maybe it will feel that the problem is a personal problem. It needs to improve his skills to be quicker. So it will not say anything to anyone. However, I would say that the feeling that there was too many abstractions and it took so much more time than it should have, likely is not a good thing, and it's a warning that we need to do something. So, does this sound familiar for you? This is happening everywhere, in many companies. Because we have started using this and we have confused the complexity with sophistication. We start believing that more layers is equal to a better architecture. That if you are not using the latest way of doing things, you are not being professional. The truth is that teams that are shipping faster, that take less time to debug an issue, that sleep better at night, they don't need to be using mediator. They know that there's a place for mediator or a library like that, and there's a place to have a direct call to a given method. And they know that, and they are not afraid of admitting that they have still a proper architecture, even if they are not using mediator. So if you have ever felt that you are fighting your own code base, if you have ever wondered why touching a small, simple feature needs to go to different files, or if you ever spent more time explaining the architecture than it should be, then you are not alone. And this is a great question to ask. So why most developers and great developers keep going after something like this? Let me be honest. I have used mediator in a ton of projects, and I have went through all of those problems. I have been in the camp where it was fancy, it was something that looked professional. I was so glad for being able to use that. I was sharing it with everyone. I was using in every single project without even asking, is this the proper place to use mediator? Without even asking if mediator will be fulfilling his own mission, or if it's just something that I feel it's cool. But it's quite easy to go through this trap of adopting MediatR just because. Why? Because it's shiny, it seems perfect, it gives you every single thing that you were thought of. Like if you are thinking about clean code or keeping those abstractions, it's great. So why would you not use it? So picture this. You are starting a new project. Maybe you read about clean architecture, CQRS, domain-driven design. You are trying to apply all of those solid principles properly. And you look at your controller and you think, this is getting too fat. I need to separate the concerns. So someone in your team, or maybe a blog post, or maybe a conference talk, or maybe an open source project will introduce you to MediatR. You read the wiki and it's beautiful. It's so simple. You quickly get it. Okay, it makes a ton of sense. So let's try to apply it. For example, if you look into this controller, it's so simple. It's so focused. The controller doesn't know anything about the business logic. It just sends the command and returns the result. Your handler is equally focused. It feels like you just discovered some architecture enlightenment. So the single responsibility principle is there. Your controller has a single job. Dependency injection is there. Open-close principle checked. So looks perfect. And you show this to senior developer, staff engineer, an architecture, and they will approve you because it's a great way to build software. And even if you look online, if you go to LinkedIn, you will have that positive reinforcement. Everyone is talking about it. If you go to the NuGet page, you will realize that MediatR has millions of downloads. It's used by respected companies. It's mentioned in a ton of articles. So you start having it everywhere. You have to handle user creation, you use MediatR. You need to have order processing, you use MediatR. You need to have a simple data queries, you will use MediatR, and the list goes on. Each time that same clean separation, each time that same professional feeling. Your project structure will look impressive because now you have that segregation of the commands, of the queries, of the handlers, all of that. And every single thing has a single job. It's the dream of a developer. And for the first months, it feels amazing. You are writing testable code, you are following design patterns, your classes are focused and thin, and when you explain your architecture to someone, you will feel fancy. This is why developers get hooked to it. It's not because they are bad developers. It's because MediatR is great delivering its own promises. The first few commands and queries you write really do feel cleaner than putting every single thing inside of a controller action. And that separation, in the reality, makes your code easier to test. The pattern really feels scalable when you are looking from a 3,000 step foot view. But this works great when everyone is familiar with the code base, when everyone is familiar with the pipeline, when everyone is familiar with design pattern. When you get out of that happy path, that happy scenario, things are not as great, in my opinion, in many use cases that we have. Because the cognitive load with all of those abstractions tends to build up. When you have someone without experience on that topic, it becomes a problem. But I don't say that MediatR isn't great or isn't powerful, because it is. But as any great and powerful tool, we need to know the problems that we are addressing and the problems that we should avoid. And in most teams, in my opinion, they are not solving anything valuable to add one extra dependency. So we already know that MediatR is great. We already know all those benefits that we can find in MediatR, from single responsibility and all of that stuff that we talked before. Now we need to talk about the costs that we need to face. First of them is the fact that debugging something might require more cognitive load than in a traditional way of writing code. In a scenario where you have the code in the controller action that eventually calls directly another dependency, it becomes simpler to debug something. While when you are using MediatR, if you are not familiar with that project yet, if it's a part of your code where you don't know where things are, how they were built, you never touch that code, now you need to first understand the pipeline. Because you might be familiar with MediatR and you look for the handler, you put the breakpoint, and things don't fail there, for example. Now you need to understand the pipeline. Maybe there's a behavior that is, for example, a validation that is happening before. So now you need to find that, put the breakpoint there, and first basically understand the complete pipeline before actually fixing the issue. But there's other cases, for example, when you actually need to change the code. For example, imagine that you need to bring a new parameter to a given operation. Traditionally, you would think about maybe going to the object that comes in or trying to go to, for example, to a method that is processing that data, adding an extra argument. Now you need to change the perspective. Now you need to think about the commands involved. You need to think about the handlers involved. You need to think about if there's other behaviors in the pipeline. So you need to touch all of those points. So it's even more cognitive load. We also have the performance costs. And yes, this is being extremely nitpicking for most of the use cases. The penalty of using MediatR is quite small. However, if you are in a scenario with an high load, extreme demand, you are in an hot path, it might be a problem. So that performance hit, in most scenarios, it's something that you can dismiss, you can ignore. However, it's something that in a high throughput system with thousands of operations per second, it might be a problem. Because as naturally will happen, you'll need more objects in memory. Things will not be as simple as calling directly a given class or a given method. If you are concerned, for example, with the startup of your application, you also need to think about the discovering moment when you register things. For example, if MediatR is scanning for handlers in your application at startup, it might have an impact on the startup time of your application. What can be a problem if you are building something like a serverless function or a desktop application where the cold start time really matters to provide a proper user experience. But in my opinion, the real problem is the onboarding complexity. For example, in the case of Mike that we talked before, if he's just starting his career, is even a competent .NET developer with experience writing .NET, but maybe he never got in touch with MediatR. It was not part of the code base he used to work. So now he has a learning curve. Now, to be productive, he needs to understand that. And it's not just the fact that he needs to understand MediatR, because in the reality, MediatR is quite simple, is that in many cases, we try to go fancy with MediatR and we might have a ton of customization that doesn't bring value. And now he needs to understand that. He needs to understand the pipeline. He needs to understand what is a command, what is a query. He needs to understand how to fit all of those things together. So now they need to ask for help from someone with experience in the team just to do small changes in the code base. The question isn't if MediatR can work or not. The question is if the complexity that we have, it might be small, if the complexity that we have will pay for itself. And for most teams, most of the time, the answer is no. Now, before you start thinking that I'm simply anti-MediatR or I'm just saying bad things about MediatR because of the commercial change, let me be completely clear. There's a ton of scenarios where MediatR makes a ton of sense. There's many applications that I have built that I will keep using MediatR, but there's other scenarios where it doesn't make sense. The important thing is to make an informed decision instead of just following what everyone is doing. MediatR will shine if you have complexity, in fact, real complexity. And also, if you have a code base that has a ton of operations that you need to have a pipeline defined, and then you are accepting to take that cost of investing in people on teaching them that pipeline. So let me give you a real example. I'm working with a company where they have to process a ton of information, and every single operation that they receive, whether it's a create, an update, an approve, or reject, something like that, it needs to go through the same process. They need to have, for example, authorization checks. They need to have audit logs. There's compliance validations that need to happen. There's a set of business rules that need to be applied that are customizable by the business operations team. There's notification triggers. There's a state change tracking. And we are talking about 7 to 8 cross-cutting concerns that need to be applied consistently across more than 40 operations. In a scenario like this, having something like MediatR, a pipeline of behaviors, is basically gold. Instead of needing to remember to manually add all of those concerns in every single operation, having all of that code in a single method eventually, this is just a better way of doing it, because now they have that focused responsibility. They can programmatically define their pipeline, and they know that it will be applied to every single place, every single time, and they don't forget it. The cognitive load in this case, in fact, will be reduced, because now, when you have a new operation, a new business operation, you are just focused on the logic of that operation. All of those infrastructure concerns will basically happen for you. Besides that, they know that this is enforcing a consistent way of doing things. Instead of having some developers doing things in one way, other developers doing things in other way, they have a consistent way of doing things. It's becoming a bit more predictable. But this is happening, and it's a benefit, because they have more than 20 developers working on the same code base. Even if they expand this to different teams working in the same code base, any team can add a functionality by creating a command, by creating an handler, without needing to touch the entire application or changing the architecture. But I want you to notice something on this scenario that I explained. This is driven by complexity that in fact exists, not complexity that we are aspiring to have. They are not having MediatR because it looks cool or because it looks the fancy way of doing it. They are using it because it's solving and it's addressing a real issue that they have in place. So here's how you know if you have one of those cases. Can you point out a specific pain point that MediatR is removing and addressing it for you? Are you dealing with a ton of cross-cutting concerns that need to be applied in multiple operations? Do you have any type of coordination problems between teams because you are not able to do it in a standard way and you use MediatR for that? If you can't answer yes to one or two of these questions with a concrete example, maybe you are using MediatR where you shouldn't be using. Another way that I like to see this is when I look into the implementation of MediatR in a given project, and I realize that they basically have, for example, commands that they forward to an handler. The handler will process it, return the result. But then you try to find a pipeline, there's no pipeline there. What they have is a set of pairs of commands or queries and handlers. Just that. On such cases, I don't think you are taking advantage of MediatR. It could be a direct access to that handler. You can still use the concept of an handler. You can still use the concept of a command, but you don't need to forward that command to MediatR to being handled. It's hard to define a rule of thumb for this, but let's try to have one. So if you have fewer than 5 developers, I would say, and less than 20 business operations, it's quite straightforward to handle them, and you don't need to have those multiple pipelines. You can address it maybe with action filters and middlewares. It feels like MediatR will be an overkill. If you have a big team, if you have more than 50 operations, you have a complex workflow that you need to handle with a ton of cross-cutting concerns that you need to apply in a standard way, MediatR might be exactly what you are looking for. But the key word here in this sentence is might, because you need to think if that complexity of the scenarios is something that you want when compared to the overhead that you might have in terms of cognitive load and all of that stuff. But at least you are taking that decision consciously instead of just going after what templates are doing. So the bottom line is that MediatR is a power tool for complex problems. Using it in simple problems is like using a chainsaw to slice bread, I would say. It's technically possible, you can do it, but it's not the best choice of a tool to do that job. And if you find yourself one of those use cases where it feels great, be aware that the ecosystem is evolving, okay? And also consider if that's the thing that you want to use, or if you want to use any other type of library. Maybe there's other types of things to use. But again, only adopt it, only adopt a library, only adopt a framework if you have an actual complexity use case for it that requires this level of abstraction. So what's the simpler approach actually looks like? We want to have all of those benefits that MediatR promises, like the separation, the testability, the maintainability, without all of that architectural overhead that we have been talking about. So let's start with the most common scenario. You have a controller that needs to perform a given business operation. Instead of creating a command object, an handler, and then routing every single thing through MediatR, you simply inject your service directly into the controller. Just that. So this is how it looks like in practice. You take your customer update example from early, and with MediatR, you would have something like this. Update customer command, for example, with all the properties, an update customer command handler that implements the handler interface, and a controller that sends the command through MediatR. That's 3 different files with 3 concepts that we need to understand. In the direct approach, you can do something as simple as this. And that's it. Just one method call. So when someone is debugging that source code, they just need to step into to see what the method is actually doing it. So they don't need to understand the pipeline or the command objects or trace the execution, understand the handler registration and all of that. But maybe you are thinking, what about the single responsibility? What about the testability? What about the clean architecture? Let me address all of those. For testability, in simple applications, directly injecting something, it in fact can lead to tests that are easier to understand. You don't need a ton of complexity because in fact you don't have so much logic to justify spreading all of that logic through all of those files. Maybe having just a single file, it might be the best approach because your problem that you are addressing doesn't require all of those abstractions. You have tests that are focused on a single behavior. For single responsibility, your controller is still doing one thing, handling the HTTP concerns, delegating it to the proper service. Your service also is doing one thing, because the business logic doesn't have that amount of different things that justifies breaking it down. And if it justifies doing it, you can still extract classes in order to do that. So it's still simple and clean without that extra abstraction. What about the cross-cutting concerns? This is where most people would say that MediatR is the best thing to use, but maybe you can do exactly the same thing with a different approach. For example, are you thinking about validation, a common use case? Why not using something like action filters, for example? What about using something like data annotations? So you can have your validation logic being explicit, visible, and applied in the places where you want. Okay, so you can still apply the same idea that you are using the pipelines for. For logging, for example, you could be using something like a middleware, or even trying to apply something like a decorator pattern to achieve exactly the same thing. For example, if we try to apply the decorator pattern to achieve the logging in the exactly same way as MediatR is doing in a pipeline, we could do something as simple as this. Okay, we could have our logging customer service that will have access, will receive through injection the iCustomer service. So that means that first we can log what is coming in and then call the next service. Once we call that service, if we want, we can, for example, log in case of an exception or in case of success and return it. The difference is that when you are debugging it, you can see exactly what is happening. It becomes a bit more simpler, okay? The cognitive load is not that high. It doesn't need to go through all of those loops or go into a library, into the code of the library, and then get back to your code. For authorization, you can use authorization policies and action filters. For caching, you can use method level caching attributes or service decorators as well. For database transactions, you can use something like a unit of work pattern, something that is quite common to apply, for example, with a repository pattern. And here's the pro tip. If you are worried about having too many dependencies in your controller, in your constructor, .NET gives you other options. You can still use something like the from services attribute to inject services into individual action methods. And if you are using something like .NET 6 plus, for example, .NET 8, .NET 9, you can consider to use something like minimal APIs, where you can inject those services as parameters and call the handler that way. That will eliminate the need of having a controller class. And for many use cases, even having the logic inside of that entry point of the minimal API, it might be more than enough. And what's the benefit of taking one of these approaches when compared to using a mediator with behaviors? Is that they become explicit and visible. When you look at the controller, when you look at the minimal API entry point, things are a bit more clear. What will happen, it's a bit more clear. And when something goes wrong, you know where to go. But what about the organization? It's something that we usually think about it. Okay, how do we keep things organized? So in fact, that's quite simple. You can organize every single thing by feature instead of going with a technical concern. Instead of thinking about, for example, a comments folder or an handlers folder, you can, for example, have a customers folder with the customer service, with the customer models, all of those things organized by feature. Everything that is related to that customer operation can go to a single place. It becomes easier to navigate. And if you like the organization that you have gave to your code by using Mediator, with things like handlers and commands and all of that, you can still use all of that. But instead of calling the mediator.send, you can call the handler directly. You will receive the handler through injection and you call the method. And the benefit is that if at a given point, in fact, you need Mediator, in fact, you need those pipelines, it's quite easy to migrate to it. But only do it if that complexity cost will actually be justified. You don't need to upfront invest in order to one day take advantage of it. So after every single thing that we talked about, you might be thinking, Guy, how do I actually decide? How do I know if I'm one of those teams that needs Mediator or if I should simply stick to a more direct and simple approach? This is where most developers get stuck because there's no clear guidance. Everyone will say it just depends. Many will say just use it. Well, I'm going to give you a concrete description of how I approach this type of decision. So let's start with the most practical factor, that is your team. If you have fewer than 5-6 developers working on the same code base, likely Mediator will be an overkill. Here's why. Those coordination benefits that Mediator will give you, like the consistent patterns and the standardized approaches of doing things, those benefits usually only appear or only matter when you have enough people to coordinate. With small teams, everyone tends to know the code base, everyone tends to communicate directly, so the overhead of Mediator likely will slow you down instead of bringing you those coordination benefits. For example, I have seen teams of 3 people trying to decide or change without agreement the way that the pipeline is set up. Why not having a different discussion? But it's not only about the team size, it's also about the team experience. If you have 5 senior developers who understand those architectural principles, if they in fact can coordinate without those rigid patterns or rigid systems, things will work out. But if you have, for example, 12 developers with a mix of experience levels, having Mediator defined in those standard ways might be a good way to prevent juniors from taking other types of decisions that in the long term might be a problem. Then you have the business operations and the complexity of those operations. The number and complexity. We are not thinking about the number of endpoints. We are thinking about the operations that exist in your system, like creating users, approvals, generating reports, processing an order, closing an order, all of that stuff. If you have just a small set of those, like 30 distinct business operations, probably you don't need MediatR. But the simple way to test it is, can one person know all of the operations of your business? Okay, can they get familiar with it in a day? If so, likely you don't have that complexity you don't have the complexity that will justify MediatR. Following MediatR is trying to solve a problem that you still don't have. But it's not just about the count, it's about the complexity. Are your operations just CRUD operations, like reading, updating, deleting data? Or they have validations, they have an approval stage, they have logging requirements and auditing as well. If they have complex rules and you need to define a workflow that is consistent across them, MediatR is great for that. You also can analyze the cross-cutting concerns that you need to have in place. If you make a list of all of those, like the ones that I talked moments ago, like authorization checks, audit logging, performance monitoring, validations, caching, logging, transaction management, for example, error handling, maybe even some kind of logic of rate limiting. If you have 2 to 3 of those that you need to apply every single time, but they are quite simple, maybe action filters and middlewares can handle them for you. But if you have 5 or more and you need to apply them in different combinations, for example, depending on the operations, if you need to be able to configure that pipeline dynamically, maybe MediatR can be a great way to do it because the pipeline is quite powerful. So here's my recommendation for any team that is actually considering using it or actually considering replacing it with other thing or reevaluating MediatR. My recommendation is start simple. Start in the most simplest way that you can do it. You can build your application preserving all of those good properties of MediatR with that separation of concerns, with those explicit cross-cutting patterns. You can have all of that without MediatR. Eventually, it might start to become a problem to coordinate the work of all of that complexity, all of those people working in the same code base, and then you can think about migrating to it. If you are currently using it, you can do the logic like, if I was today starting to implement this thing with all that I know, would I still use MediatR? Would I still need to use it to coordinate my work? Or could I do it in a direct way, in a simplest way? Because remember, the goal isn't to build the most sophisticated architecture possible. The goal is to build the simplest one that will solve your actual problem. So here's what I want you to do right now. And I mean actually right now, instead of bookmarking this and forgetting it. Don't have review MediatR usage to your backlog in the next sprint. Just take some minutes and do this today. Go to your project, your current project, the one that you have been working, and I want you to quickly do a kind of like an audit to MediatR. Take a look into how many handlers do you have. Check if you have a pipeline in place. Check if you have validations. Check how many cross-cutting concerns do you have. And then ask yourself a simple question. If you remove MediatR from this application today and you directly call that service, that handler, would actually anything break? I don't mean any good principle or any design pattern. I mean actually any functionality would break. I can guarantee that you'll find many handlers where the honest answer is no. Nothing would break. You just need to route the operation in a different way. Instead of going through an abstraction, go there directly. So if you pick one of those today, it won't take more than 10 minutes. You can call it directly. And it's a first step. If you are trying to get out of MediatR, it's the first step to do. You don't need to delete the handlers, you don't need to delete the commands. You can still use those concepts, but just call them directly. Then run your tests, and if it feels safe, you can leave it that way and commit the code. And then please take a moment to observe how much simpler and easier to understand your code became. Once you do it, come back to this video, leave a comment, let me know how did it go? How did it feel once you have done it? However, if you are one of those developers where actually MediatR makes sense, I also want to hear from you. Please come here, drop a comment, tell me your specific use case where it makes a ton of sense, the types of problems that MediatR is solving for you. So here's what I'm not asking. I'm not asking to go to your applications and drop and remove MediatR from every single place. I'm asking you to take the conscious decision if you actually need it, or if by removing MediatR, you are simplifying your application. Because honestly, many of us never ask that question.